Hey everyone, before we begin this last part of this discussion over Revelation, I just wanted to quickly point out, I did an entire series over the book of Revelation, and while there are some things I would probably change since it's been over a year and a half ago, maybe some language I would change differently, the information there is actually pretty helpful. If you want to understand more about the history and certain topics like the number 666, all that, I'm going to attach a link for those of you who are interested in that. So there'll be a link with the description of just a whole series of teachings I did over this. And also, I did a whole series called Letters from Patmos, which is over those 7 churches, more of a devotional kind of element, more geared toward what could this mean for me as an individual. And so I'll also do this. I'll take some time next week to cover whatever questions you pose to bring some closure to this misused book. So please send those questions to me at Tony Werfel, that's WUERFEL @gmail.com. And we'll kind of move through it together because, again, I think for so many of us, we just need to find some closure with this book because it's been misused so often. And a couple resources I'll also add to the podcast description, a couple books you might find really helpful with kind of moving through how to move past the literalism and move into more of an understanding of how to view the text responsibly. There's 2 books I would recommend. One is Reading Revelation Responsibly, which is by Michael Gorman. And another is Apocalypse and Allegiance, and the individual's last name is Kraybill. So read those 2 books if you're really interested in going deeper. And I hope you enjoy this last podcast over Revelation. What do you do when your faith system no longer fits? Because sometimes you outgrow it. Sometimes you graduate, you ascend, you leave the old, itchy, worn-out way, and you begin to walk in the new. Sometimes you grow. Join the conversation with me, Tony Werfel, author, speaker, teaching pastor, as we help unwrap and rebuild a faith that no longer fits. We learn to walk into the new, messy journey called life. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Faith Undone, where we learn to deconstruct and then reconstruct a faith that works, something that we don't have to check our brains out at the door. And so we've been going through the book of Revelation, and it's been pretty exciting. I've actually gotten a lot of emails from many of you and a couple trolls here and there, but it's been really exciting. And so last week we talked about how this book has this general theme, and it's teased out over and over again. Only every time it's brought up, it's described darker and more detailed. And so this writing style, this is what they called apocalyptic writing. Again, it's not about future predictions of something that's going to happen. It's about a very present reality right then, right now. And again, message of hope and challenge. And so we're going to finish by looking at a couple of places where we see this theme of overcoming beastly empire by using this lamb-like peaceful protest. We're going to look at that throughout the rest of Revelation. I'm going to kind of skip through pretty quickly because you can just get lost in the detail. But if you keep in mind, again, the theme is being basically teased out over and over again, it'll make sense. And so after the 7 churches are described, we have chapters 4 and 5, and it's basically describing a throne. And people have gone a little bit crazy over this too. What does the throne represent? And does this mean like the throne that someday is God sitting up there, way up there in heaven and cloudy paradise? Is that what's happening? Is that what he's describing? Not really. He's describing a throne for a purpose because a throne is something people understood. Something interesting actually happened at the throne. In fact, if you look back at throughout Scripture, you'll see all these different places where ancient Near Eastern culture, they were very familiar with the throne because that's where the figurehead, the one that represents the entire empire, would sit. And so Daniel 7, Isaiah 6, you'll see this kind of teased out. And so even for Roman culture, they understood thrones as well. And they understood the emperor was the identity of the entire empire. It's what the empire stood for. And so what would happen at the throne, in the throne room, is that they would begin offering up hymns, reading poetry. They'd give praise. And here's something else that's interesting. Lesser kings would often go and bow down before the king, and they would lay down their crowns in reverence to the emperor. And so please understand, what John is doing here is he's saying, look, there is a higher emperor. There is someone who actually epitomizes the idea of what an empire should look like, even better than Domitian. Do you see how seriously political John is being? And so again, it's no wonder he is murdered, right? And so after the throne room, we move into chapter 6. And it's all about like this dreaded 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. I have this funny t-shirt that says the 4 ponies of the apocalypse. People have kind of gone crazy over the image of these 4 horsemen. And they've tried to make them into certain eras or papal figures or again, missing the point. Because if you were living during that time period, and you read about the throne room images, the 24 elders in white laying down crowns, the 4 horsemen, you would make the connections immediately. Now, in that time period, they had this really crazy emperor. Actually, I shouldn't say crazy. He actually brought a lot of interesting good things to the empire, but he still was the epitome of power and using force and violence to obtain territory and power. And so you had this Emperor Domitian, and he absolutely loved accolades. He felt he was God on earth, had the title actually Son of God. Come on, I think you're getting it now. And again, I'm sure in our culture today, it would be very hard to imagine a political figure or a leader who presents himself as the greatest thing since sliced bread. I'm sure that's hard to imagine. But to them, Emperor Domitian, he loved the accolades of the populace. And so to celebrate his greatness, he would bring together everyone from everywhere, all over the empire, and he created something called the Domitian Games. And we kind of discussed this a little bit last week, where the governors would come before his throne, which of course is decked out in jewels, surrounded by a choir of singers all dressed in white, leading praise, worship songs. He did this all to kind of prop up himself as the king, the emperor, the greatest thing, right? And so he'd then have, get this, he'd then have a race. Watch this. 3 riders would come out. 1 dressed in red, 1 in white, 1 in black. Again, history is so interesting. When we remove the Bible from history and we just start creating crazy ideas about what we think it is, man, do we go way off. But when you actually look at the history, it all begins to make sense. And so these riders, they would race and battle each other to death. And there was this massive carnage, and people are killed right and left in this death race or battle. And people, again, during this time period, they valued this. War, violence. These were all things of worth for them. And so watch this now. At the end, a man dressed up, usually a slave, dressed up as Death or Hades, would come out on a horse with a cart attached, and he would put the bodies into the cart. Because that's what would happen in the Colosseum. It's the way of Rome. So again, anyone who's ever read this book, Revelation, lights are beginning to ding. There's sirens going off. You're like, okay. Because what John is doing here is he's teasing out Rome valued war, violence, power. And this whole scene was homage to power. And so essentially what you have here is John is making a connection to Domitian's throne and a different throne, exalting a different kind of leadership that he feels is far more deserving of praise. And so the battle being fought, it changes. So while Rome would honor the great warrior king, John and his followers, the followers of Christ, they value a different kind of response. They value a lamb-like response. And please understand, it is a response. It's not passivity. There's a response here. And so rather than fighting, though, as a response with bloody war, power, oppression, the lamb-like image of Jesus, it calls for followers to fight, but fight with love, peaceful resistance, taking power back through messages of challenge and hope, what John is doing. So essentially, the Christian movement is being called in this book of Revelation to fight, but fight differently. See, we fight beastly empire by acting lamb-like, which is, according to John, not powerless, but powerful. Because for John, he actually has this lamb-like Jesus overcoming the beastly dragon power of Rome. Because for the new thing to begin, for the old way to pass, there has to be a death. There is actually a war. But this powerful resistance piece, this book Revelation, it tells them, and us today, I think, that you can choose to fight differently. You can choose to fight differently. I wasn't going to talk about this, but I think I'm going to. I have a friend who, he came out not that long ago, and I actually haven't even asked him if I can use this story, so I'm not going to use his name, but I think I'm going to try to interview him at some point. He is just the epitome of love. He is the epitome of what a lamb-like follower of Christ looks like in the face of injustice. This guy, he came out. He said, look, I don't believe the church is going the right direction with the questions of homosexuality, and I'm going to let you know right now, I publicly don't fit this anymore. I am a homosexual. He came out. And it was interesting because my friend, he essentially got beat up over and over and over again. Kicked out of certain places, told you don't belong here. And instead of acting angrily, instead of doing what so many of us do and demonizing the system, instead of fighting dirty like they fought, my friend, which again, I'm going to share his story, and I'm even getting a little emotional telling you this, because I spent over like 3 hours talking to him over and over and over again. My friend, he said, I have no ill will toward the church. I love the church. I love the people there. And I choose to fight differently. And so my friend has over and over again been a loving, forgiving, accepting presence to a system that doesn't accept him. And that's what we call lamb-like. So beautiful, so powerful. And that's how we fight differently. He hasn't given up. He is very, very present in that system. He will not go away, even though they want him to sometimes, I bet. He's not going away. And man, what a powerful statement that is. Because that's powerful, peaceful resistance. Now, later on in this book, there's this description of a city, and big surprise, its measurements, the city, by the way, it comes down, and oftentimes we've tried to say, well, that's heaven someday that's going to come down, and we've made all these weird futuristic predictions of this. That's actually not how these people would have read it in this first and second century. That's not how they would have read it, because the city is actually the exact dimensions of Rome. And so this city, this empire, is described as coming down, falling over Rome. So understand this. It's not saying this city literally falls down on top of Rome. It's saying this city, it actually replaces Rome. That's the idea. And so John is saying the old way of running things, it has to pass away. And in its place, a new kind of system will emerge. So he's putting his faith and trust in the messages, the teachings of Jesus. Because just like Jesus, John believes that love is going to win the day if people are willing to truly live it out. And we're told this about this interesting kingdom. We're told the gates are always open. And so I've heard a slew of different people trying to understand what that meant. Again, if you simply look at history, you'll get it. Because for the Romans, gates were closed when the country was at peace. They kept themselves inside, which is actually like the polar opposite of what most theologians attempt to say here. But historically, Rome would close its gates. When they were at war, again, overpowering other empires, there was a steady stream of soldiers going in and out of the gates. So understand how powerful this description is. John is calling people to revolt. He's calling this movement to war. Come on. This is so exciting. He's calling them to fight. And again, you fight differently. You fight restoratively. This new empire, this new way of being in the world will always be at odds with beastly empire. It will always wage war against the things that bring death. And so the Christian movement was not a bloody war against other nations for more power, resources, or land. That's not what it should be. The Crusades was actually a very beastly attack on Christianity led by Christians. What we should be fighting is injustice, and we fight injustice differently. Here in America, we have to change the way we fight. We have to shift the way we view battle, don't we? Because again, I believe we won't ever win battles by adding more hate and anger and political angry propaganda, oppression, racial slurs. That's only gonna add more flames to the fire. I think the only way we truly win, to truly cause the war to stop, is to put out the fire with love, justice, equality. We stop consuming, we start sharing. And so we, like the slain lamb, we fight with weapons of love. We choose to turn the other cheek. We choose to find new ways to fight injustice with peaceful protests, with sit-ins. We purposely choose not to purchase certain things. And that is an action, by the way. That's not passivity. So many of our leadership calls us to build walls, right? And when they do that, maybe our response is, we say no. We'd rather invest in bridges. Maybe when we're asked to support another war, we demand first that peaceful talks have taken place. We start asking questions, right? We start saying, hey, why are we at war again? What's going on? What resources are we attempting to take here? Should we be taking those resources? Should we be over there doing that? Yeah, maybe we have to start asking questions. We start having peaceful conversations first. Maybe when our nation, and I'm going to say this, I know it's not a popular thing to say, but maybe when our nation is attacked by another terrorist, we choose not to allow fear to guide our decision making, run toward retaliation. Maybe we choose to understand the circumstances that caused the terrorism. Again, maybe we ask questions. Maybe we seek to understand our enemy. Maybe we learn to see our nation's part in the conflict. I'm going to get some emails about that one. What does it look like for your own lives and family, community, for you as an individual? Maybe it means instead of responding with more venom in that conversation with like your father-in-law or whatever, you choose to amicably agree to disagree. You give the guy a hug instead of choking him out, right? Maybe you chose to show love toward that coworker that drives you absolutely nuts. Maybe you speak up in the meeting, but you do so with like a new sense of calm. You rationally discuss a better restorative way. You're grounded in the way you speak in that meeting. You don't allow the anger to burst forth, but you sit with it for a minute. Maybe we could all learn to fight differently. And I think that's the beauty of this misused book, Revelation. Maybe we, like John in that early movement, we don't sit by passively, and we don't respond beastly, but we respond like a lamb. We respond with love. And so I hope next time you read this book, you'll keep those ideas in mind. And maybe you'll lose some of the literalism and the geopolitical decoding and drop the decoder rings and the graphs, and maybe you read it differently. And I think when you do, that book will make some sense. And it might even call you to be a better human being. Blessings, everyone. Next week, I'm going to answer some of the questions you've posed, and I think we'll have a lot of fun. Take care, everyone. Blessings. See you next week.